If you think artificial intelligence was born in a Silicon Valley server room just a few years ago, you are off by about 70 years, an ocean, and a world war.
Yeah, quite a bit off, actually.
Right. I mean, you ask almost anyone today where AI came from, and they'll usually point to the phone in their pocket.
Exactly.
They'll credit some modern tech giant, or maybe just assume it all kicked off with the release of ChatGPT.
Which is, I mean, it's understandable, but it's totally wrong.
It is. But assuming AI started with a modern chatbot well, it's a lot like thinking space travel started with the Mars rover.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like, you see this incredibly sophisticated piece of technology executing tasks that look indistinguishable from magic, and you completely miss the generations of agonizing work, the foundational theories, and the spectacular failures that even made it possible.
Right. It's just the ultimate recency bias. We get handed the finished product, the polished interface, and we are completely blind to the massive foundation beneath it.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to really pull back the curtain on a comprehensive historical breakdown of AI's 70-year journey.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. We've compiled the source material, and the core theme jumping off the page for you today is that artificial intelligence is absolutely not an overnight success.
Not even close.
No. It is the culmination of decades of just stubborn perseverance through periods of total obscurity. We are going back to the brilliant and frankly tragic beginnings.
Yeah, back to a time when a computer was something that literally filled an entire room.
Right, running on vacuum tubes.
Yeah.
And the very concept of a thinking machine was just pure science fiction.
And to understand that beginning, we really have to look at the year 1950 and focus on a British mathematician named Alan Turing.
Okay, Turing. I think a lot of people have heard the name, but maybe don't know the specifics.
Right, so he published a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which it basically opens with a proposition that would alter the trajectory of human history.
Which was what, exactly?
He essentially just asked, can machines think?
Wow. Which is such a massive, intimidating question to drop in 1950. I mean, how do you even begin to measure that when you barely have computers?
Well, Turing recognized the trap in the question immediately. He didn't try to define the biological mechanics of thought because trying to define the internal state of consciousness is basically a philosophical black hole.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you cannot definitively prove that the person sitting next to you on the bus is thinking in the exact same way you are.
Right. You just assume they possess consciousness based on, like, how they act, their external behavior.
Exactly. So Turing proposed using observable behavior as a practical proxy for thought. He called it the imitation game, which we now know as the Turing test.
Wait, okay, hold on. If the test is just about whether a human can have a text-based conversation with a machine and not realize it's a machine, isn't that essentially just a parlor game?
A lot of people thought that, yeah.
Because it sounds less like measuring actual internal brain power and more about measuring a machine's ability to, pull off a con.
It definitely seems like a trick on the surface, but the underlying genius of it is its pure pragmatism.
How so?
Turing was saying that the internal mechanism doesn't actually matter. If a machine acts intelligently, if it responds to complex inquiries, adapts to the conversation, and processes information indistinguishably from a human mind, then for all practical purposes, it is thinking.
Okay, so it kind of bypasses the philosophy debate entirely.
Exactly. It bypasses the philosophy and gives scientists a tangible, observable target to actually aim for.
And Turing wasn't just an ivory tower philosopher spitballing ideas either. The sources make a real point to highlight his practical genius.
Oh, absolutely. He was brilliantly practical.
Right. During World War II, he led the team at Bletchley Park that cracked the Nazi Enigma code. Like, he literally built the electromechanical machines that deciphered German military communications.
And his work in cryptography is widely credited with shortening the war by years. He saved millions of lives.
Which is just monumental.
It is. But despite that world-altering achievement, Turing himself believed his greatest contribution to humanity wouldn't be breaking codes. He believed his true legacy would be the thinking machine.
Which, man, that just makes his personal story incredibly devastating. The historical record here is just grim.
It is awful.
The man who laid the foundation for literally the most important technology of our era never lived to see his question answered. In 1952, British authorities arrested Turing for being gay, which was a criminal offense in the United Kingdom at the time.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom now.
He was convicted and subjected to chemical castration. And then just 2 years later, in 1954, he was found dead at the age of 41, with a cyanide-laced apple beside his bed.
Yeah. The official verdict was suicide. And it remains just a profoundly tragic end to a life that gave the world so much so early on.
But, his ideas survived. And that leads us directly to a pivotal moment just 2 years later, right? The summer of 1956, where this theoretical conversation becomes a formal scientific discipline.
Right. So this is when a young mathematician named John McCarthy organized a gathering at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire.
Okay. The famous Dartmouth Conference.
Exactly. He called it the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. He invited 10 of the most brilliant minds in mathematics, logic, and early computing to just spend the summer hashing out the framework for thinking machines.
And looking at the sources, the guest list reads like the Avengers of mid-century science.
Oh, it really does.
You've got Marvin Minsky, who goes on to co-found the MIT AI lab. You have Claude Shannon, the literal father of information theory. Nathaniel Rochester, who designed the IBM 701, which was one of the first commercial computers.
Real heavy hitters.
Yeah. But the most important thing to come out of that gathering was the name itself, right? By calling it the Project on Artificial Intelligence, McCarthy coined the term. He gave the whole pursuit an identity.
He really did. He took Turing's proxy for thought and turned it into a legitimate named field of science.
Right.
But, and this is where it gets kind of funny, the proposal McCarthy wrote to secure funding for this conference is where we see the sheer breathtaking hubris of the era.
Oh, this part is wild.
He wrote that they would proceed on the basis that every aspect of learning and every feature of intelligence could be so precisely described that a machine could simulate it.
And the timeline they gave themselves to solve human intelligence was what, 2 months?
Yep, a summer break.
A summer break. It's like a group of friends, deciding they're going to build a working space shuttle in their garage over the summer, assuming they'll just hammer out the physics by July and be in orbit by August.
It really captures the boundless optimism of the time. But, you have to view it from their perspective back then.
How so?
Well, these were logicians and mathematicians. To them, computers were already doing the quote-unquote hard stuff.
Like the math.
Right. These early machines were crunching massive calculations and executing complex mathematical proofs at speeds no human mind could match. So they logically assumed that the soft stuff, like recognizing a shape or understanding a basic sentence or learning from a mistake, well, that must be relatively trivial.
Oh, I see, because the math was so hard for humans, but easy for computers.
Exactly.
And for a brief window, it really looked like they were right. The decade following Dartmouth was electric.
Very much so.
The sources detail early AI programs that were genuinely shocking for the time. Programs that could play checkers and understand rudimentary English.
Yeah, the early successes were undeniable.
The standout one to me is the 1957 Logic Theorist, built by Alan Newell and Herbert Simon. It proved 38 of the 52 theorems in Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica.
And it didn't just brute force the math, right?
No, it actually produced one proof that was mathematically more elegant than the original human-generated version.
See, when you see a machine displaying that kind of sophisticated logic in 1957, you can see why researchers were publicly declaring that a fully intelligent machine was just 10 to 20 years away.
Right, the optimism was just off the charts. But that early success with symbolic logic actually created a massive blind spot.
It did. A huge one.
Because being able to manipulate mathematical symbols or, play a highly structured game of checkers did not mean a machine possessed actual intelligence or perception.
And this is where the narrative shifts drastically for our listeners. The problems of human intelligence turned out to be far deeper than anyone had calculated.
How bad was the reality check?
Well, teaching a machine to play checkers is relatively easy because the rules are rigid, the board is finite, and the environment never changes.
Right, it's a closed system.
Exactly. But teaching a machine to understand context, to handle the ambiguity of spoken language, or just to navigate the messy, unpredictable reality of the physical world, those were not simple engineering problems. They were fundamental mysteries.
So the symbolic approach hits a brick wall. And as we move into the 1970s, the industry enters what is known as the first AI winter.
Yes. The initial promises of human-level intelligence failed so spectacularly that the funding just simply evaporated.
Wow.
Governments and corporations pulled their grants, labs were shut down, researchers had to scatter to other fields. The grand dream of the thinking machine was basically put in the deep freeze.
But the industry does try a pivot in the 1980s. The sources highlight a brief revival driven by something called expert systems. How did those change the game?
So an expert system was a departure from trying to build a general human mind. Instead, it was an attempt to encode the highly specific logic of a human expert into software using massive, complex networks of if-then rules.
Okay, so like a giant flowchart.
Pretty much. If condition A is met and condition B is absent, then execute action C. It was a way for corporations to automate highly specialized tasks.
And they were incredibly lucrative for a moment, right? Like companies like Digital Equipment Corporation use these expert systems to configure custom computer orders, saving them millions of dollars a year.
Huge money. It sparked a massive global reaction. Japan launched the fifth-generation computer project, pouring funding into intelligent machines.
Right, which then triggered defensive funding from the US and the UK. So AI was back in business. But wait, if these systems were saving corporations millions and government money was pouring in, why did the field crash a second time?
Because of a concept called combinatorial explosion, which basically leads to severe brittleness.
Brittleness.
Yeah. The real world doesn't fit neatly into if-then rules. Say you build a medical diagnosis expert system. It works perfectly until a patient comes in with a slight fever, but they also have a rare genetic marker, and they just traveled to a specific country.
Oh, I see.
The number of possible edge cases in the real world explodes exponentially. You literally cannot manually program a rule for every single possibility in the universe.
So the moment the system encounters a variation that isn't explicitly in its flowchart, it doesn't just make a slight miscalculation, it breaks entirely.
Exactly the problem. They were completely brittle, they couldn't adapt, and most importantly, they couldn't learn from experience to update their own rules.
That's a fatal flaw.
It was. So when Japan's massive project failed to deliver and the specialized hardware companies built to run these expert systems started collapsing, the second AI winter arrived in the early 90s.
And this one was worse.
Far colder than the first. The term artificial intelligence became heavily stigmatized. It was professional suicide to put AI on a grant application.
Seriously.
Oh, yeah. Researchers had to hide behind labels like machine learning just to keep their funding alive.
That is wild. But while the mainstream scientific community was actively treating AI like a toxic asset, our sources show that a totally different, highly controversial approach was quietly surviving out in the cold.
That's right.
An approach inspired not by top-down human logic, but by biology.
We are talking about artificial neural networks. And this wasn't a new idea either. The concept actually dated back to the 1940s.
Okay, so how does it work compared to the expert systems?
Well, the theory argued that the human brain doesn't process information through rigid if-then flowcharts. It processes information through billions of interconnected neurons. Every time you experience something or learn a new skill, the connections between specific neurons are either strengthened or weakened.
Okay.
The proposition was, could we build a machine architecture that learns the same way?
So instead of programming the rules, you build a network, feed it data, and let it figure out the rules for itself.
Exactly. But the broader scientific community repeatedly dismissed neural networks as a total dead end.
Why? If it mimics the brain, shouldn't that be the obvious path?
They dismissed them because, for decades, they were computationally impossible. To make a neural network actually learn, it uses a mechanism called backpropagation.
Backpropagation.
Right. Say the network it looks at a picture and guesses it's a dog when it's actually a cat. It calculates the margin of error and then mathematically works backward through all its artificial neurons to adjust the weights and biases of those connections so it guesses better next time.
Oh, wow. So it's constantly self-correcting.
Yes. But doing that complex calculus across thousands of neurons requires a staggering amount of computing power they simply did not have in the 80s and 90s.
Enter Geoffrey Hinton, a Canadian researcher who refused to let the biological approach die.
A true pioneer.
Through the 1980s, the 90s, and into the 2000s, while the entire industry was chasing other methods or avoiding the field altogether, Hinton just kept working on neural networks. He championed an approach called deep learning.
Yeah, and deep learning essentially means using neural networks with many different hidden layers stacked on top of each other. This allows the system to learn increasingly abstract representations of data.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. So the first layer might just learn to recognize edges and shadows in an image. The next layer takes those edges and learns to recognize shapes. The next layer takes the shapes and recognizes a human face.
Okay, let's just unpack this for a second. Imagining dedicating decades of your career to a mathematical architecture that your peers think is a computationally expensive joke. That level of conviction is just staggering.
It really is. I mean, even when Hinton published a major breakthrough paper in 2006 detailing how to train these deep networks effectively, the broader AI community largely ignored it.
If you just ignore it.
Pretty much. But Hinton and his students kept refining the math, and eventually two massive forces converged to catch up with their theories.
What were they?
The explosion of digital data on the internet and the rise of GPU's graphics processing units designed for video games, which, as it turned out, happened to be perfectly suited for the parallel math required by neural networks.
Which brings us to the first massive paradigm shift of the modern era in 2012.
Yes, the ImageNet shockwave.
Right. So the computer vision community had this annual competition called ImageNet. The challenge was brutal. Build a system that can look at over 1 million images across 1,000 different categories and correctly identify what is in each picture.
A huge undertaking.
And in 2011, using traditional computer vision techniques, the absolute best systems in the world were stuck at an error rate of around 26%.
Then, in 2012, Geoffrey Hinton's team from the University of Toronto enters the competition. They deploy a deep neural network called AlexNet, running on those gaming GPUs we mentioned.
And what happens?
Their error rate drops to 15.3%.
Whoa.
Yeah. The second place team, using the old methods, was still stuck back at 26.2%.
That gap is just staggering. I mean, it's the equivalent of an unknown amateur walking into the Olympic marathon and beating the world record not by a fraction of a second, but by a full hour.
Exactly. And AlexNet didn't just win the ImageNet competition, it permanently ended the debate.
People finally woke up.
Oh, yeah. From that moment forward, every serious research team immediately abandoned traditional techniques and switched to deep learning. Within just 5 years of that 2012 breakthrough, machines were identifying images more accurately than humans.
So the AlexNet moment was really the spark that ignited the modern era. Deep learning just cascaded into speech recognition, real-time translation, drug discovery, and autonomous driving.
It changed everything. But there was still one massive hurdle holding back artificial intelligence. Language. Because neural networks were amazing at static images, but language is sequential. Before 2017, AI processed language using what were called recurrent neural networks.
But how did those work?
They read a sentence sequentially, word by word. The problem was, by the time the system got to the end of a long paragraph, it mathematically forgot the context of the first few words. It just couldn't hold the broader context in its memory.
Which brings us to the second massive paradigm shift. In 2017, researchers at Google published a paper titled "Attention is All You Need," and it introduced an entirely new architecture called the transformer.
Yes, and the transformer solved the memory problem by moving away from reading sequentially entirely. It introduced a mechanism called self-attention.
Okay, so wait. If older AI read a book by staring at one word at a time and forgetting the start of the sentence, how does self-attention actually change the way a machine understands words? Like, does it read the whole paragraph at once?
Basically, yes. Think of self-attention like a detective standing in front of a massive evidence board with red strings connecting every photograph and document to every other piece of evidence simultaneously.
Okay, I can picture that.
When a transformer processes a block of text, its context window, it doesn't just read left to right. It mathematically weighs a relationship of every single word to every other word in that window at the exact same time.
So if it sees the word bank, it uses the self-attention strings to look at all the surrounding words at once.
Right. If it sees river and water, it assigns a specific mathematical weight to bank as a geographical feature. But if it sees money and account, it weighs bank as a financial institution.
And because it does this for every word simultaneously in parallel, rather than sequentially, it can be trained on massive, unprecedented clusters of supercomputers.
Exactly. This specific 2017 architecture is the absolute bedrock for every major generative AI system we have today. I mean, the T in ChatGPT stands for transformer.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the culmination of this entire 70-year timeline. November 2022. OpenAI releases ChatGPT to the public.
A historic moment.
And the adoption metrics rewrite the record books. 1 million users in just 5 days.